So we're 1 minute past the hour, so I might kick things off if that's okay with you, Helen, and I keep admitting people. I'm going to multitask. So hello, everyone. My name's Celeste Tremonti, and I'm part of the Association for Coaching, hosting today's session on imposter syndrome. As Helen mentioned before, we're speaking to you from Melbourne, Australia, the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Eastern Kulin. So before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. We acknowledge and honour the unbroken spiritual, cultural and political connection to the peoples of the Eastern Kulin to this unique place for more than 2,000 generations. I'm very happy to introduce to you our presenter this evening, Helen Brooks. Helen and I met whilst we were both studying for our masters in applied positive psychology and coaching psychology. And as soon as Helen shared with me the topic of her research and how grounded it was in a real world experience around imposter syndrome, it really struck a chord with me, and I knew that we had to share what she was discovering and her insights in a session like this. So Helen, it is with the utmost pleasure that I hand over to you to share a little more about yourself and start our exploration of this very important topic.
Thank you, Celeste. I am delighted to be here with you today talking about imposter phenomenon, or imposter syndrome as it is more commonly known. Imposter phenomenon, or IP as I will abbreviate it to because it's such a mouthful, is a topic that I am really passionate about. And it's also one that just really seems to resonate with so many people across such a range of backgrounds and experiences. And every time I do this kind of talk, regardless of the audience, I'm always amazed and I suppose a bit humbled by the level of interest and engagement. It really does seem to strike a chord with people, as Celeste said. Now, joining today, as Celeste and I both mentioned, we have people from different countries and time zones, and not everybody here is a coach. We have people from a range of professions interested in this topic. So I extend a really warm welcome to you, whatever time of day it is for you, and whatever brought you here to be interested in this topic. And I hope you get something useful from the session today. Now, nothing triggers imposter phenomenon quite like presenting to a panel of your peers. And with over 200 people signed up to this session today, you can probably get an idea of where my thoughts went. And I guess I see there's an irony in seeing imposter syndrome emerge in myself at the prospect of doing a talk on imposter syndrome. But one of the benefits of reading lots of articles on this and doing the research instead of having a social life is that you do become familiar with it and you recognize it. And while it doesn't go away completely, you do learn how to harness.
Helen, you're on mute.
I just got it. I think. Did you do a mass mute, Celeste? I'm not quite sure what happened there.
I apologise. I think that was my fault.
You just thought she's talking too much. Just turn her off. That's right. Don't worry. So I'm not sure when I lost you, but basically it's I guess it shows that you can manage imposter phenomenon, and I've helped it myself and I've helped it in my coaching clients. By way of a very brief introduction to me, like so many people on this call, I'm an executive coach. I was a management consultant for 23 years, and I still do management consulting as well. As Celeste mentioned in her introduction, I have a master's, I think, in applied positive psychology and coaching psychology, which is where Celeste and I met. So in my coaching, I kind of bring understanding of being in a professional environment for my coaching, for my consulting experience, and then also understanding of positive psychology, wellbeing, resilience topics from my master's. Now, in this session today, we're going to talk about imposter phenomenon in terms of the impacts, coping strategies, and the role of organizations and coaches in helping people to manage it. The session draws extensively on my MSc research, which looked at these aspects of imposter phenomenon specifically in management consultants. But the findings align with a lot of wider research out there and are relevant to actually a range of professional people. As I go through this information, I invite you to consider what it means, not just for you personally, but also in terms of how you can help your clients too. So you can do a bit of sort of double hatting on this, depending on your experience of IP at the moment. We will have an interactive session today. I will do some talking, and there will be 3 interactive breakouts, because I know that a lot of people on this call will also have experience of either experiencing it themselves or working with it. And I'm very keen that you get to share some of that expertise and insight as well. So without further ado, I will start sharing my screen, and I'll just give it a second just to load up. And can you all see, if you don't give me thumbs up, Celeste, you can see the slide? Yeah, all good. Okay, so just let it catch up on me a bit. There we go. So what is imposter phenomenon? It's also known as imposter syndrome, as I said at the start. In academia, or if you want to look up a research paper, should you feel so inclined, look up imposter phenomenon, because it's not generally used. The term syndrome is not generally used in academia because syndrome is a medicalized term, and imposter phenomenon is not an illness. But nevertheless, it is the term that is most commonly used. So I will use the 2 terms interchangeably in this session. When we talk about imposter phenomenon, and people are quite familiar with the idea that you feel like a fraud, you're going to get found out, you're faking it, you're not really up to the job, feelings of self-doubt and inadequacy, and often where successes do happen, they're externalized. They're put down to outside things like the role of other people, or it wasn't as hard as people thought it was going to be. Now, in coaching, we often talk about the inner coach and the inner critic. And in the case of imposter phenomenon, the inner critic is getting an unduly large voice, and the voice of the inner coach is being pushed down. So that tends to be what happens. Now, imposter phenomenon is made up of cognitive distortions that influence behavioral and emotional elements and can turn into a downward spiral. The key thing here is the word distortion. Imposter phenomenon it's not a valid view of your abilities. It's not an objective view of performance. It's a really negative view, overly negative view, and underestimating that capability, despite often quite strong evidence to the contrary. In the UK this year, we lost the legendary Michael Parkinson, who's, for those of you not in the UK or not familiar with TV hosts and presenters in the UK, Michael Parkinson was a bit of an icon of his generation. Now, in the news just recently, his son said that Parky experienced IP throughout his career, despite him being effectively, you know, a real groundbreaker and a hugely effective presenter. Michelle Obama, Tom Hanks, John Steinbeck, Emma Watson are all people that have talked about their experience, and that is not a list of underachievers. But nevertheless, when you experience IP, it can be really hard to break that cycle because of those cognitive distortions. Now, in terms of the prevalence of imposter phenomenon, it was originally identified in female academics in the 1970s. It has, though, been found to exist across genders. The evidence is equivocal, so it's unsure really and mixed as to whether women experience it more and experience it differently, but it is prevalent across males and females. It's prevalent across ages, professions, and ethnicities. Now, this is an important point because I have seen articles over the last kind of year or so in the Harvard Business Review and the New Yorker, which reflect a wider trend, I think, that say that IP is effectively something created by the sort of dominant patriarchal forces in society to sort of subjugate women and minorities to make them feel inadequate and out of place. Now, while I completely agree that there are major inequalities and biases, both conscious and unconscious, in the workplace, there are 2 reasons we need to be very careful with conflating these 2 arguments or these 2 points. Firstly, I believe in following the data, and the evidence does not back up this view, because if you follow that line of argument, it should be only women and ethnic minorities that experience it. Now, when I went into my research, I she expected imposter thoughts to be more of a female issue, but there was an even split of respondents in terms of the number of people replying, and while women did score higher, it was only by 5 percentage points, and both males and females were significantly in that higher category. So we'll talk about the overall levels in a minute, but the key thing here is it's not just women. And secondly, on the subject of equality, someone's not on mute. If you wouldn't mind going on to mute, that would be great. If we want to make sure that we are helping everybody with it, then we have to make sure we're helping the men too. Now, 70% of people experience it at some point in their lives and to varying degrees. So I've also heard people say, well, that's just life. Everyone has it. Just get on with it. The key thing here, though, is how frequently and how intensely you experience imposter thoughts. If you experience it a bit, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It can kind of keep you on your toes. But if you experience it a lot, both in terms of frequency and intensely, it can have some quite detrimental personal and professional outcomes. And we're just going to talk about those now. So in terms of adverse personal implications, workplaces, it's great to see, are really focusing on mental health and well-being in their staff. Imposter phenomenon is really linked to those topics. So if you experience high IP, your increased risk of depression, stress and burnout, reduced mental health and well-being, and reduced confidence and self-esteem. So organizations need to be aware that when they're dealing with well-being and kind of resilience kind of topics, they need to be aware of how imposter phenomenon can come into play. Now, there are some benefits on the professional side. There's something here about it. The research shows that it can make people work harder, which gives good results. And that's the bit about if you don't have it a lot, it can keep you on your toes a bit. But the key thing here is how much harder you're working and for how long. Because if it's not sustainable, then you're going to end up in that aforementioned list of depression, stress, burnout, etc. So there's just something to be aware of on that. Another interesting piece of research that came up was which showed that people who have imposter phenomenon are actually more empathetic and other person focused. So they're more aware of how other people are feeling. And that can actually make them really good team members and also team leaders. So that is a positive side in this. But for me, I think that professional implication, and the research, it's not just personal opinion, the research shows this, that the adverse professional implications outweigh the benefits. It has been labelled an inner barrier to progression. That's not my phrase, but it's a good one, I think. And the key word there is inner, because it's not about performance. Again, it's your own thoughts that make you hold back. Now, that kind of holding back occurs in kind of two ways. Firstly, you're less likely to kind of advocate for a promotion and progression if you feel like you're clinging on anyway. And often career progression is linked to visibility. And if you're worried about being exposed, you might be less likely to put yourself forward. Secondly, that linked to that holding back thing, if you're kind of clinging on and working really hard just to kind of feel like you have to just to stay where you are, you're less likely to put your hand up for more. And often progression in professional environments is linked to those extra things that people do around the day job as well. So that's where some of the implications come into play. Now, Adam Grant in his book Think Again talks beautifully about that sweet spot between imposter syndrome and overconfidence, and he calls it confident humility. And I think there's something for me there around, if you do experience imposter phenomena, how do you harness it enough so that it stops you going into the overconfidence, but it doesn't make you hold back completely and deal with that kind of grinding, wearing out that can come with imposter phenomenon. Imposter phenomenon is measured on a scale out of 100. If you use the Clancy's one, and Rosemary Clance was the person who first came up with the term. The results are split over 4 categories, but anything over 60, so 60 out of 100, is above the healthy threshold, and that leaves you, if you score over 60, it leaves you at risk of these personal and professional implications. In this study, 72% of people scored over that 60 threshold. So, and in a couple of organizations, we had over 30 to 45, between 30 and 45% of people replying. So this isn't one or two people on the periphery for whom it's a pet topic. These are significant parts of those organizations. And that indicates to me that for management consultants, like a lot of other professional services firms, people are very committed and they're probably quite high flying and they're potentially therefore anxious overachievers who could be at risk therefore of these adverse implications. In the research, I'm going to stop. We're in a breakout before I carry on. I'm on a roll, Celeste. You have to hold me back. So we've got 8 minutes now. It's a very short breakout. In the other two breakouts, we will do a plenary feedback after, but for a couple of groups, if anyone has anything they want to share. But for this one, this is just in your groups. Just discuss what indicators do you see in yourself or others that imposter phenomenon might be coming into play. So Celeste is going to work her magic and pop people into groups, and we will call you back when the 8 minutes is done. Celeste, how are we doing?
Opening the rooms now.
Lovely.
We can kick back off again.
Lovely. Thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Can I ask everybody, please, but just to go back on mute, because everyone will have unmuted when they were in the breakouts. Celeste, if not, if you're able to meet people, that'd be great. So, in terms of triggers of imposter phenomenon, so one of the questions that we asked in the research was what kind of things triggered for people, and the key themes that came up were external or internal. Now, triggers can also be positive or negative, and they can be massive or they can be very small. So something as amazing as getting the job of your dreams and that big promotion you've always wanted, it's great, but it can give you, but it can trigger imposter phenomenon. Or something as small and negative as someone talking over you in a meeting and you're feeling like you're not being listened to. So there's a perspective of things, a range of things. But in terms of this research, the key themes that came out were interactions with others. Now, that could be in terms of client meetings, dealing with senior people in your organization, presenting to a panel of your colleagues and peers, a sense of not being listened to, or difficult team dynamics. And we'll come on to the more kind of organizational cultural piece in a minute. The next one was around new roles, projects, or activities. Now, in this particular population, that really makes sense, because as a management consultant, you go into a new project and you're expected to be performing from day one. People expect you to be, by 10 o'clock in the morning, what have you done? And you're often pitched in as an expert. So it's not surprising that a new role can be triggering, or a new project. But it can also be little internal things like, joining a social committee or doing some internal training. And so this is something that is would be common across multiple industries and roles. The third one, though, that really interested me was feedback and reviews, in that positive feedback in the form of performance reviews, or being positioned as an expert to others, or just as a high performer in general, was as triggering of imposter thoughts as negative feedback. So I found this fascinating, and I didn't expect to see this in terms of, so when we give positive feedback as leaders, we assume that people will feel good. But in practice, this shows that if they hear it at all, which they might not, it might actually be triggering of imposter thoughts. Now, we will see when it comes to coping strategies that positive feedback is hugely important to enable you to positively reframe. But the way we deliver it, we just need to bear that in mind, that it can be triggering. So in terms of external triggers, they were those things. Internal triggers then, internal perception of expertise. So this is, we often set ourselves impossibly high standards. Sure enough, we don't meet them, and then we beat ourselves up about it, which shows that we're faking it and we're not up to it. And then the flip side of that is that comparison with others. So you undervalue your contribution and overvalue and overestimate that of others. And so that can also be triggering of imposter thoughts. The next part was looking at coping strategies in terms of what coping strategies people used and how effective they were perceived to be. And we used a standard coping scale for this. So 6 strategies were offered. And what was really interesting is that the most frequently used were not necessarily the most effective. So we can see here that acceptance was the most frequently used. So ranked from high to low in terms of most frequently and least frequently, acceptance was the most frequently used. But when we asked people to rate how effective they were, we see that acceptance drops right down to 5th. When I did more detailed analysis on this, people with really high imposter thoughts were more likely to use acceptance. So we have this high population of people who are experiencing really high imposter levels, and they're not doing anything about it, and it's not working for them. Now, I will just distinguish here between, there is a difference between, I don't think I'm good enough, I'm going to be found out, I'm not up to the job, and thinking that's a valid thought, versus I'm experiencing imposter syndrome. It's a cognitive distortion. I know I experience it. It is what it is. It will run its course, and I accept that. They are two different now. That the latter, in terms of accepting that you have imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome, can actually be a really important first step in enabling you to name it and accept it, and then start to manage it. That's healthier. But this idea that they're valid thoughts and you're just not up to the job is really, really not helpful. I'm not going to go through all of these today. I will jump down to emotional support and instrumental support. So the others on the list, the top 4 in terms of frequency of use, are internal coping strategies, so the things that you're doing in your head. Emotional support and instrumental support are what we call social support strategies. And these are where you're going to others. Emotional support, so you're going to people for help with how you're feeling, what you're thinking. Instrumental support is you're going for kind of actual help and guidance on something. Now, we can see in this population that they were the least used strategies, and even when they were used, they were found to be the least effective along with acceptance. So you could say that while they've been found to be useful in other populations, for this population, they're just not particularly effective. But in the next section, we'll talk about what, which was around the role of organisations in helping people to cope. And we see that there was a real appetite, actually, for organisations to help their people. So clearly there is some challenge here around, are organisations aware and equipped and doing the right thing to help people? The final one I'll just draw attention to on this slide is positive reframing. Now, positive reframing, I think we have on the next slide, is rethinking a negative or challenging thought in a more positive way. Now, when this is the second time we've run this particular session for coaches, and there was some confusion, I think, around this, because people, there's lots of different ways that you can get people to positively reframe. This isn't talking about any specific way of positively reframing, but it's just more questions that you can ask your clients. It's not a particular training course you have to go on or anything like that, but it's just the questions that you can ask to help your clients to see things differently. So when they are talking to you, help and ask questions that will help them to even out the focus on the good as well as the bad. You know, we're very familiar with negativity bias and that tendency to focus on the bad. It's helping people to start to think, well, it wasn't all bad. There is some good in there as well. And actually to enjoy the good in those experiences, which links to the third point around identifying the upside of the experience and what actually went well, and to savor that and acknowledge it, because quite often with imposter syndrome, people will just want to move on and forget about it because they don't think they did it well enough. And then the other one is just identifying the lesson, because sometimes things don't go to plan, and actually they aren't, you know, what we want them to be. But there is something here about having a growth mindset around, okay, it didn't go to plan, but instead of using that to kind of reinforce this message that you're not up to the job, use it as kind of, okay, so what can you do differently in the future? So in this context, just some questions that I use with clients, if it's helpful for you, is, am I recognizing the positive parts of my performance? What have I learned from this situation that will help me in similar future situations, particularly around those imposter thoughts? It's like, you know, every time you start a new project, this is how you feel. You do deliver, you know, how well do you deliver? So how can you, really challenge this thought process that you're not up to the job? What are the strengths that person brings? No one brings everything. And I'm a Clifton strengths coach, and I find that helpful with people, because it helps them to realize there's a whole spectrum of strengths out there. And no one is really strong in everything, so they can value what they do bring, and also be therefore comfortable in what other people bring and value that, as opposed to feeling threatened by it. And then the other thing is just, how can I label these emotions to be more, so I can be more positive, or so that they're more useful to me. And that links a bit back to this kind of this confident humility thing that we talked about earlier. So hopefully that kind of gives you some insight. Now you may have tools that you already use yourself, like ABC and things like that. That's a great way of doing this, but you don't have to go on a full kind of training course on it. But positive reframing was found to be the most effective. So the more we can help people, and this links back to that feedback point, because when you are experiencing those cognitive distortions, it's hard for you to acknowledge your positive contributions. And this is where, as coaches, we can help people to do that instead. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not like you're going to have this one conversation that's going to completely transform for people, but they can start building, helping that voice of the inner coach to come to the fore instead of just the inner critic. So developing the muscles of the inner coach as well as the inner critic. So it's little steps that you can help people to kind of change their thought processes. So we're going to go back into our second breakout now. And the question here is around bearing in mind the findings on the triggers and coping strategies. What have you noticed works in helping yourself, your coachees, or your colleagues with imposter thoughts? There'll be about 10 minutes in the breakout groups for this, and then we'll have about 5 minutes. It's lovely to hear what people talk about, so you're not just hearing from me. It's lovely to hear what people talk about in the groups. So as you are in your groups, think, oh, this could be something that would be interesting to share when we're back in the main session. So please do share when we come back. Celeste, how's the magic working with the groups?
Magic is working slowly but surely.
Thank you.
We just got to be patient as the room slowly opens.
Lovely.
And I will pause the recording while people are
reason I want, because I could talk about it all day. I find it a really interesting point in that we talked on about trauma and sort of where trauma plays a part in this, and upbringing and childhood messages, and what, particularly in the coaching space, where those boundaries and the contracting and all of that, and how far you go with some of these issues that might be raised within that, and the signposting, but recognizing when there is that jump off point for the coach. But imposter syndrome, it feels like there isn't just one or two things, that it can mean many things to many people, but manifest itself in many different ways. But also the extent, for some people, just reframing something might very quickly solve it for them and it clicks and they're off. But for others, it's actually more traumatic and so ingrained in their beliefs that actually, particularly again bringing it back to that coaching, is there's an ethical part of this as well, around how long you can go on coaching somebody, what difference can it make, and at what point does it need to be passed off from a coach to a more professional body, counselling, or a greater medical intervention. Faye and Tilly, I'm not sure if you want to add any more. That was sort of the crux of our discussion.
Yeah, I would agree.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating, and thank you for sharing that. That's it's a really interesting reflection on it. I think in Rosemary Clance's original paper, I think that she talks about the childhood kind of role a little bit, not massively, but a bit. And you mentioned about manifesting it, about how imposter phenomenon manifests it in different ways. And I think a really good, like, simple example of that is that some people, they will work much harder and just beaver away frantically, and other people will their response mechanism is procrastination, and it's almost an act of self-sabotage, so they leave it too late to perform well, and then that kind of, they go, well, that's because I'm just not up to the job. So that's an example of how people manifest it differently. So it absolutely right, this is not a one-size-fits-all thing. So thank you for that. Ron, I think you were next.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a question. It's just this idea came up in both the breakouts, one of which is I think it's easy to get caught up in the idea of imposter phenomenon in these big events where something's coming up that might make anybody anxious or have a lack of confidence in what's about to happen. in my practice, I think the place that I find most useful to look is in the everyday moments. You're with a senior executive and they're not about to go on stage, or they're not about to do a webcast. They're about to go into a team meeting that they've done a million times, and there is where it starts to show up. And so I find myself getting a little confused and find that it's too cloudy when there's some big event to think about this topic, as opposed to how is it showing up right now. They're about ready to do something they've done a million times, and they're experiencing and wanting to talk about that. I don't even know what this comment is, other than just a point of separating those two in my mind, and at least in some of the discussion we're having around, where do you look? Where do you find the most value in having the discussion? I don't know.
That's interesting, because it does manifest in those small events and in the big ones as well. I suppose my reflection on it would be that if you're getting it in the small moments, you definitely want to be focusing there, because that's kind of that day-to-day thing that just kind of wears you out. If you only experience it for the bigger events, then maybe that's just natural adrenaline kicking in to some extent, and maybe that kind of what you want to talk about to the client then is around acknowledging the role that adrenaline is playing. Where are they feeling it, and how do they choose to acknowledge that adrenaline? Is it leaning into the challenge, or is it fear, and trying to kind of build it that way?
Definitely, Helen. I think one of the things I wrote down quickly on my paper when you were speaking earlier is the issue's frequency and the type of frequency, I think. And so I grabbed that. I think it's a very useful comment.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. Fee, let's hear from you, and then we'll jump on.
Sure. I was just going to say, I think I find I can do either or. So firstly, let me go back to that. So I'm a coach, but I'm also, I have terrible imposter syndrome, or imposter phenomenon. And I find that I can switch between absolute bloody procrastination, and I'll procrastinate, clean and do everything else, or I can just work my butt off. Like, I've not got off this chair now today for 12 hours. So, and then what I find helps me, and this is just specifically to me, obviously, is that if I'm having a bad time, I will pull out my resume and I'll go, actually, I've done some really cool things.
Yes.
And I've had some really interesting and responsible positions. And so I must be okay, but it can be crippling.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing, Fee. And I think that's you're absolutely right, because it can be. And I love that you have identified a strategy that works for you. But also, I think it's really interesting that you've pointed out that you will respond in different ways at different times, and how that kind of works for you. And I'd be curious, we won't go into here, but in terms of how they are there different reasons why you go for one or the other, and that's something that you can explore with your clients who are also experiencing the same, and finding those situations or those strategies that work for you. And I think that the CV thing is fantastic, in terms of, I always encourage people who are not feeling confident to, if they've got to write their CV, to pretend they're writing it for someone who they really rate in their in their team. Imagine they're writing the CV for them. I've noticed I've stopped sharing. Have I stopped sharing for all of you as well?
I just switched it over because a few people were asking just to see the speakers as people were talking.
Fine. Okay.
Because it was a bit disproportionate, the thumbnail compared to the slide. So apologies,
Lovely.
Helen.
No, that's fine. That's fine. As long as it's not. Celeste and I were discussing tech issues in the breakout, so I was just checking it wasn't my screen going on.
It's not you.
Shall I? It's not me. Phew. No. Shall I go back into share mode?
That would be great.
And we will continue. So make sure my laptop wasn't kicking off. So there we go. Now, the other part of the research we looked at, because I wanted the research to be practical, was the role of the organisation. Now, I'm referencing it in this context because obviously when we coach people, we need to recognise the systems that they're operating in. Now, this is talking more about professional environments, but if you're a life coach or working with people not necessarily in a professional environment, some of this will still be relevant to you. the points are really worth exploring with your clients in terms of what's going on for them, and because IP can be it is an internal concept, but it is impacted by the wider environment that people operate in. So organizations can help or hinder individuals in managing IP, and this is based on wider research and as well as the research that I did. So many of you will be familiar with the term psychological safety. Amy Edmondson's book, Fearless Organization, is a great one if you haven't come across it. Organizations, they can exacerbate the effects of IP on people if the environment that people are working in lacks psychological safety. So people go to work and they fear making mistakes because they'll be unduly punished. They fear communicating openly and being authentic because they will be ostracized. They fear taking risks. When environments lack that psychological safety, people will feel that they are more kind of under threat, if you like, and imposter syndrome will kick in. The other way that it really shows is you may be familiar with the demands versus resources model of stress, and you want your perceived demands to be in balance, your perceived resources to be in balance with the demands of the job. And if they go out of kilter, then stress can occur. It can either be over or under stress, but in this context, we're talking too much stress happening. And this can be, a vicious cycle, really, because you perceive that the job demands are too much and you're not coping, so you work harder, which makes you more susceptible to burnout and stress, which makes job demands feel worse, which means you feel more stress, and so on and so on. So organizations can make, and that's where, that's a ripe breeding ground for imposter thoughts, and so that's an area where that can really come into play. But there's also research that shows that organizations can have a positive effect on imposter thoughts in terms of managing it well. They can reduce the negative effect of imposter thoughts on job satisfaction. So people experience it less, so they feel a bit less kind of ground down by it, and on work engagement as well. We talked earlier about that kind of working harder. Well, that can obviously have issues around work-life balance, conflicts, and organizations can help people to manage that. Coaching can really help people to do that as well. And also, we've talked about imposter phenomenon being internal process, and organizations can help to be the external influence that disrupts those cyclical negative thought patterns and help to break that cycle if they're managing it well. We asked we asked the population, as a free text, what could people start, stop and continue doing? And then I got the themes together, and the stop ones are basically the reverse of the start and continue. So I've left them out here. And there were 4 key ways that people wanted more help. The first was around imposter phenomenon specific actions. So it's more training and awareness sessions like today. There's a lot more of that kind of a start thing going on. So running these kind of sessions in organizations, and also about it just making it a common part of the vernacular. And I'll come on to that a bit more in a minute. Engagement with individuals, so more holistic one-to-ones instead of making them just about tasks. Effective feedback. I'm going through this slide quite quickly, so I'm going to talk about it all more in the next one. So effective feedback and role allocation, more other support in terms of coaching, mentoring, job-related training, etc. So people feel like they're a bit less frauds in the job. And there's also that wider culture and structural piece around open, inclusive, meritocratic processes. So these were some of the key themes that people requested. And so then I thought, looking across the prevalence and the surprising prevalence of imposter thoughts in this population, looking at what the impacts were, the triggers, the coping strategies, and what people were asking organizations to do, I basically pulled it into sort of those 3 key levels that we see here, 3 levels of levers that organizations can have interventions at, and also as coaches, how you can help. Starting at the top one with individual engagement, there's a few things that sit under this, and this is about the one-to-one engagement between the individual and the organisation, and or in this case it would be the coach. The first one, we remember we talked about positive feedback earlier and how that could be triggering of imposter thoughts. We also saw, though, in the separate section about positive reframing being so important, and this is where all these different parts interlink. So there is something here about when leaders are giving feedback to individuals, they need to make sure that they're definitely doing it, because it's hugely important to help that positive reframing, to build that bank of things that people can draw on, so that when they go into those downward spirals, it's back to, you know, the regular kind of helping people to build that CV that they can refer back to, that we were talking about really nicely in that breakout. It's helping people to build that bank, because they won't necessarily identify it themselves. But when you give feedback, make sure that it is authentic, it's timely, it's genuine, it's not given in the context of the proverbial sandwich where you are going to give someone bad feedback, so you give them a bit of good feedback to soften the blow, because that completely undermines what you're trying to achieve. When we did this session last time, people asked, we're kind of curious a bit more on that positive feedback piece. So just as an illustration here, instead of, you know, and I know that you wouldn't necessarily be giving this feedback as coaches, obviously, but if you're hearing this in sessions, this might be useful. So instead of people kind of leaders going up to people going, you did a great job presenting a program boards, you smashed it, great feedback from the sponsor, keep it up, smack on the back, walk out the room. You know, that is nice, you know, and that will really work for some people. If this is not a one size fits all. You may be familiar with the SBI feedback model situation. So you're being very specific. When you presented the work plan to the program board on Tuesday, that was the situation. The behavior was that you communicated the approach and timeline very clearly. You were really constructive when one of the board members raised concerns. And then talking about the impact, you know, the sponsor spoke to me afterwards. As a result of your presentation, the board is now clear and confident in the direction we're heading. You did a great job. Well done. So that's a standard kind of SBI sort of model. But then I add in reflection at the end. So I encourage people that once you've given that feedback to go, what are your thoughts and reflections on that feedback? Because that can open the door to someone being able to saying, well, yeah, no, I thought, you know, I didn't think I answered Bill's question very well, or, you know, whatever. And then that gives you as the leader or the coach, whatever, the chance to probe and be open and mirror and ask more questions. Now, as coaches, you are unlikely, as I said, to be giving the feedback potentially, although I know we've got wider organizational leaders on the call, so that'd be relevant for you. As a coach, though, you can definitely bring in that reflection piece. So really probe on when people go, oh, you know, oh, that job was fine, but whatever, and brush over it. Okay, give me the specifics of when you got feedback or your own reflections on what you did. And then what are your thoughts on kind of, you know, any feedback that you got, and just challenging, unpacking and helping them to build that bank. So feedback is one. Check-ins on well-being is something that is really important, because there's a bit of a perception in the respondents that a lot of it could be around specific tasks. Often in coaching, we are really focusing on that well-being, and so we are really well placed to help people to have those check-ins. But also, if you are coaching a leader to be a better leader, you can be encouraging them to have these kind of check-ins with people that are holistic, not just about the task to hand. Make it okay to express vulnerability, and also when people are looking at getting new job, you know, new roles within an organization, or they're looking for the next promotion, as leaders to be looking around and going, right, who in my team is not pushing themselves forward, and what assumptions am I making about why they aren't pushing themselves forward? And then having that conversation, because we can assume if someone doesn't put themselves forward, well, you might not even notice, or you might make assumptions that they're just not really up for it. But actually, if you can bring in imposter syndrome and confidence and stuff into a regular part of your conversations with your team members, it's much easier for someone to say, actually, I'm really nervous when I start a new project, or if I'm just starting a new piece of work, or whatever that might be. And now the evidence, we've talked repeatedly about, this is not linked to actual performance. So you can have two people about to start a new role. One is going, yeah, I'm going to smash it. And the other one's going, oh, I've got imposter phenomenon. I'm kind of quite nervous about this. That doesn't affect how they'll perform. So make it okay for people to be vulnerable. This is a real area the coaches can be doing work with their clients to unpack what's going on for them. The second layer around organizational support, that is more around making sure organizations are offering coaching, that they are offering mentoring, that they're offering the right on the job training, and the infrastructure is there and in place. As coaches, you won't necessarily be able to influence there, but if we've got leaders on the call, just be aware of the role that, you know, organization kind of more structural things that you can put in place to help people. And then the final one is just around organizational culture. And the key things here around building those, we talked about psychological safety, having a growth mindset in some of the positive reframing. Often as coaches, we coach leaders, and leaders play such a significant role, as I'm sure you know, in enabling that kind of open culture. Now, when leaders share vulnerability and a growth mindset in terms of being uncertain and learning from mistakes, others will feel safer doing so too. It can feel a little bit counterintuitive for leaders who are expected to don their superhero capes and go and fix everything, to actually turn around and be vulnerable and be unsure. But being unsure sometimes is human. And the more that we can be honest about that, and the more that we can be open about it and encourage our clients to be, the more that we can help create cultures where imposter phenomenon is less prevalent and does have a reduced impact on people. So we've covered a lot in this kind of talk. I've talked a lot today, and for each of you, some things will be more or less relevant and resonate more or less depending on your own personal experience of imposter thoughts and the kind of work you're doing with the kind of clients that you're working with. But hopefully there will be something for you in all of this. Now, we're going to go into our final breakout now, and when we come back, if we have time, we'll do some Q&A, but it'll be quite short. This final breakout is from your experience, what could organisations do better to support people experiencing imposter thoughts? And what could you do to help influence that? So that's a guideline question. It's kind of optional, choose your own adventure. If you do want to have a wider discussion, that's fine too. So we will do 10 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes after that for a bit of plenary feedback and Q&A kind of in together. So Celeste, over to you. Final bit of magic, Celeste.
Opening the breakouts now.
Lovely. So we've got 10 minutes left in this session, folks. Well, 9 if you count them in for a quick closeout. So we'll do a mix of feedback from the sessions, and then if we have time for any questions, please feel free to maybe pop them in the chat or raise your hand. But first of all, it was lovely last time how people jumped in with their thoughts and reflections. So who's willing to be brave this time? Val, I can see you.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts that came up, and thank you for everyone for a great morning, was imagine asking the team when you have a reflective space, is it possible our organization suffers from imposter phenomenon, and workshop around that. And the other thought which Mary Curran shared, and she doesn't have audio at the moment, so I'm sharing it on her behalf, is that sometimes when the leader of the team is experiencing imposter phenomenon, I can't get my tongue around that word.
It's hard to say, isn't
it? Syndrome, I'll stick to. They might not have the confidence to believe the steps their team want to make. And then we were thinking, and that might impact the team if that the team might think it's about them and thinking you don't trust us, you don't believe we're competent. So we sort of briefly looked at the potential knock-on effect of the leader's challenge if it's not dealt with.
Yes, and it's an interesting point, that one, and across there's a theme there of kind of individual versus organizational. The research, I mentioned the research about people with imposter phenomenon being more empathetic and other person focused, and that was kind of empirical evidence. That I read a paper in, I think it was Harvard Business Review, where someone that was talking about how people with imposter phenomenon don't make good leaders because of their imposter thoughts and their insecurities, etc. What was interesting, though, is that was an opinion piece and it wasn't citing evidence. So there might be evidence out, but the article didn't cite it. So I think it's one of those things that we need to be a little bit careful of as to what's evidence-based versus what's opinion. I think that it is potential, that there is the potential that I think one of there's links between perfectionism and imposter syndrome. And I think if your perfectionistic tendencies go into overdrive as a leader, that could be adverse, for your team. I guess the question for me is it perfectionism or is it the imposter syndrome that's kicking in? Because imposter syndrome, if we're true to the definition, is our internal cognitive distortions about our own performance and shouldn't necessarily therefore reflect on your team. But yes, there is potentially a point there that are you going to be confident enough to stick your head above the parapet for something that the team is coming up with? And I think that it's an interesting one. I don't know what the research is behind it, but it's an interesting thought. I'll say thank you. Luna.
Hi. So yeah, my group also talked about the curiosity part of leadership and vulnerability. And, the idea that sometimes it's more difficult for people who are on the fringes or, have been put there. So for women and minorities, a lot of times those effects of the structures can be more damaging. So not being viewed as competent or being questioned in your ability every day can be more damaging. And one of the things that I shared was about one of my colleagues who's a dean at one of the universities here in the UK. And she said she, as a woman of color, as the only woman of color who's a dean, was saying that a lot of the assumptions she hears from her male colleagues about women not performing and kind of being happy with their lot in life, like they've gotten to a certain level mid-career, has been because a lot of women in mid-career have childcare, but also elder care that maybe they're taking responsibility of, as well as menopause. And being curious about a woman's lack of productivity ended up being that she found it really difficult in the mornings to get into work, and with her caring roles and her menopause, and giving her flexibility at work allowed her to thrive in that organization. And I shared another organization who now makes everyone apply for promotion every year. So it's not just those who put themselves forward or those who the manager has been like, oh, I've seen that you've done this job, but everyone has to apply for promotion. It could be annoying because you're not at all ready, but it allows you to have those feedback sessions that allows you to go through promotion quicker. And I have seen a lot more women making it to professor level at that organization. So seems like it's working.
And if it's done effectively, it can help to build resilience so that you kind of, when you get the knockback, you're ready the next time and you've learned from it. So absolutely. Your point about women and how that, being repeatedly questioned, etc. Yes, absolutely. And I could happily talk for about 4 hours on gender differences at work, but I won't. But there is, when Celeste and I did our masters, there was a lady called Dr. Lucy Ryan, who has just published a book called Revolting Women, which is on exactly why women in the middle life are leaving the workplace. I have it on my bookshelf. She is a fantastic lecturer. I think the book will be amazing, but I have to confess I haven't read it yet, but I'm a book magpie, and it's near the top of my reading pile. So big shout out for Lucy Ryan, Revolting Women, if you want to read more.
You'll be happy to know, Helen, that we've secured Lucy as a speaker next year, and she'll be presenting on this topic.
There we go. It's like we prepared it earlier, but we didn't. Luna, thank you for teeing that up. And that's great to know, actually, Celeste. Let me know the date. But thank you, Luna. Really, really interesting insights as well on that one. Ron, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I felt a little kind of thrown by this last section on organization. And this might only be me, but it looked like a moment where the focus starts to look outside of the individual and put some accountability on an organization or a structure to have things in place that are going to help them move through, or at least not exacerbate this thing that they've got in the way of imposter phenomenon. And so I was having difficulty thinking about, well, are there even organizations out there? And I know you're a data-focused individual. So have you come across organizations that actually acknowledge imposter phenomenon as a barrier to their success and are able to actually tie a causal linkage to the activities they're doing to change that for their organizations? Because my experience is that there's so many initiatives, so many things coming at leaders and organizations saying, oh, you need to change this. This is what's important this week. All of these things are flooding in on them. How could you possibly get an organization to zero in on imposter syndrome and understand the behaviors that they are actually doing and exacerbating this potential barrier to their success? So two things. One, I was thrown a bit by the organization and having the focus go outside of the individual. And then secondly, I'd love to know if there's organizations out there that are actually identifying imposter syndrome as a barrier to success in their organization.
Yeah. Okay. So great points there. And I'm going to answer this in about 30 seconds so that we finish on time. So can I give you a list of organizations that are doing this? No, sadly, but it's something that we want to raise awareness on. Second of all, the nice thing about this is that it really, if you look at the topics that are coming up to help imposter syndrome, the reason why there is a bit of an emphasis on organizations is that we want organizations to have greater diversity and to value their people and to help their people in the same way that well-being is coming to the fore. And this is really closely interconnected with that. The things that you can do in an organization to help people also help their well-being and resilience. So this doesn't have to be an or. It's drawing on things like psychological safety, growth mindset, positive reframing, how you give good feedback. So it's just a lens that people can be aware of that will also help manage imposter phenomenon. It's not a whole separate chunk of work off to the side, if that makes sense. I'd love to talk more about it, but I know that we're on time. So apologies if I haven't had time to answer all your questions. Feel free to email me. My details were in the invite if you have any more questions. And Celeste, over to you. For
I'm so sorry we've run out of time, and clearly, you know, the number of questions reflects how engaging your presentation has been tonight, this morning, Helen, and I'd like to thank you. It's obviously a huge amount of interest in this topic. It's hugely relevant. It's striking a chord. I love the practical elements that you've shared, and people have really been sharing how much they've appreciated the time to discuss and reflect between the different pieces of information that you've shared, particularly, you know, being able to chat with peers around their experience. So a very deep and heartfelt appreciation and thank you for your time tonight. To everyone who's joined us. If you'd like to give Helen either a virtual or a real round of applause for her session. And on it, just a small piece of housekeeping for what's coming up next with the Association for Coaching. We just wanted to let everyone know that there's an APAC conference coming up that's both virtual and in person. Registration available, and there's a 10% discount for people who register from this date forward. It's being held on the 30th, and you can just see in the bottom corner there, that's the discount code. When you go to register, you'll be able to find it in the events section on the Association for Coaching website. And with that, I will bid you adieu. Go well into the rest of your week and weekend. And again, thank you for joining us.